Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschacha Deshatarane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Well, Srila Prabhupada. I think I'll start by talking about how I think probably all of us here, all of Prabhupada's disciples, have a similar experience that wherever we go, people say, oh, you saw Srila Prabhupada. You were so fortunate you saw Srila Prabhupada. Yes, that's true. We saw Srila Prabhupada. Most of his disciples saw him, but not all. I know some of his disciples who they never saw Srila Prabhupada. In those days, the process of initiation, well, the actual event of initiation, usually went on in a temple without Srila Prabhupada present. He would be traveling and local temple presidents would send letters of recommendation for certain devotees to become initiated. And then Srila Prabhupada would write back accepting them and giving a name, and then the local temple president, the local temple president would, or the GBC man, would conduct the fire yajna and do the initiation and give the names. And in that way, I know some God brothers and God sisters who actually they never saw Srila Prabhupada physically in the same room, or they were never in the same place that he was in, which is a very different scenario than what everyone goes through most of the time now. Of course, with the COVID experience, people get initiated over Zoom now. But generally speaking, spiritual masters are very much more physically present to their disciples than it was in Srila Prabhupada's day. And of course, we have to remember, we live in a different age now. You couldn't just pull out your phone and call Srila Prabhupada. But I think any initiated disciple here has the cell phone number of their guru, yes? Or email address, or WhatsApp, and you can send a text or an email, or you can make a call anytime, anywhere in the world. It's a very different world than the 1960s, 1970s. I mean, for instance, I was in Delhi in 1977 during the months that Srila Prabhupada was in Vrindavan, up until the point I left to come back to Australia just a couple of weeks before Srila Prabhupada left the planet. But in those days, in 1977, you couldn't get a landline connection between Delhi and Vrindavan that you could actually hear anything, except nothing else practically. What to speak of an international call? You had to book it. You had to ring up and book it. Sometimes you could get what they called a lightning call. That took about 45 minutes, but sometimes you could wait all day to get a connection to an international call.
You just have to go to the post office to book it.
Yeah, well, you'd have to go to the post office to book it, yeah. And we had telegrams in those days. I was in, so anyway, that's an example of how things have changed. But anyway, back to my point of how people say, oh, you were very fortunate you saw Srila Prabhupada. My response to that is really the fundamental relationship that all of Srila Prabhupada's disciples have with him is that we heard Srila Prabhupada. We heard him. And the beauty, again, of the age that we live in is that we can go on hearing Srila Prabhupada. And therefore, you can all have a relationship with Srila Prabhupada in the same way that Srila Prabhupada's disciples have a permanent relationship with him, in that you can hear him. You can hear him. How many people listen to Srila Prabhupada's lectures? Well, that's a fairly good response. It could be more, but that's a good response. I'm gratified to see that, because I'm recalling actually the last time I actually spoke like this was at Bhaktivedanta Manor some years ago when I was still living in England. I gave a class one morning at Bhaktivedanta Manor, and I made a reference to the introduction to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's Brahma Samhita. And then I said, oh, there's actually a very nice recording of Srila Prabhupada reading this introduction. I said, has anybody listened to that? And not one hand went up, and I was a little surprised. So I said, oh dear, does anyone listen to Srila Prabhupada? And there must have been 80 to 100 people in the class. Not one hand went up. I was quite surprised by that, quite disappointed. But it also indicates something very important that I think we can bring out today, is that you can lose a culture in one generation. You can lose a culture in one generation. It's like Ronald Reagan, famous when he was president of America, he famously said one time, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. You can lose your freedom in one generation. You can lose it. It's not free. And this culture that Srila Prabhupada has given us is something that we have to protect. And the core of our culture actually is what Srila Prabhupada says to us. So we can all have a very intimate relationship with Srila Prabhupada by hearing him. Hearing him. Srila Prabhupada is the founder Acharya of ISKCON. That means he's actually the Shiksha Guru for all of us. Not just Prabhupada's disciples. We're all Prabhupada's disciples. So that level of intimacy with Srila Prabhupada is something you can only experience. I can talk about it to you all day long. But what I'll be saying in this regard is that you have to do it to experience it. Krishna consciousness is an experiential process. It's not just a mind game we're playing here. It's not a puzzle we're trying to solve. It's an experience. And the more we expose ourselves to the experience of the higher taste, which comes to us actually through the voice of Srila Prabhupada, from the lips of the pure devotee. Then the more intimate our own individual relationship will be with Srila Prabhupada. And you will find, if you do this, or when you do this, that when you sit and listen to Srila Prabhupada, you become very much aware that on the spiritual platform, there is no separation, and that he's actually speaking to you. I'll tell a little story about this, my own experience of this. Some years ago, I guess it's about, 10, 12 years ago now, I was in Govardhan during Kartik at a retreat. And I had a little room on top of the building. And just before our reading program began one morning, I was sweeping out the room. And when I got to the door, I noticed, oh, there's a sannyasi here. So I looked up, and it was a god brother. But it was a god brother who had, he'd gone outside of ISKCON and taken sannyas from somebody outside of ISKCON. And he'd really taken shelter of that person. And so, anyway, I knew him from before, and he was all, just effervescent about, oh, good to see you, and how you doing? So I brought him into the room, and I sat down with him and gave him a glass of water, and we started talking. And just before he'd come, I'd been listening to a lecture. I was really absorbed in listening to a lecture by Srila Prabhupada. So I turned that off, and we sat and we talked. And during the time that we talked, I became quite appalled, because this fellow was talking about Gurudev this, Gurudev that, meaning this person he'd gone and taken sannyas from. And he never once mentioned Srila Prabhupada. So by the time he left, I was feeling very uncomfortable. And I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was why I was feeling the way I was feeling. So I had a few minutes left before I was going to the reading. Excuse me. So I turned on the lecture again and started listening. Just the sound of Prabhupada's voice was just the sound of his voice was very relieving. But within a minute in this lecture, he said, "You must be loyal to your Guru Maharaj." That's it. And then he said, "Because it is your Guru Maharaj who will introduce you to Krishna." I was stunned. And what I'm talking about has become so ingrained in me that I was relating this story to somebody else recently. And at the point where I said I turned the lecture on, I said, and in a minute or two, Srila Prabhupada said to me, and then I realized, what did I just say? Srila Prabhupada said to me, but that lecture was recorded 50 years ago, in another circumstance apparently, at another time. But at that moment, he was speaking directly to me, and I knew it. And you can know that. You can all know that. Just develop the habit of hearing Srila Prabhupada. Actually, from, when was it? 66? When there's in one of the black and white movies, there's a description by Gagamuni how he found a dictaphone for Srila Prabhupada. Now, Srila Prabhupada started writing his books with stubs of pencils that he got from somewhere, on envelopes of letters that he folded out for paper. He would write his books literally like that. And then later on he got a typewriter. And then he got a dictaphone. So probably somewhere from around, of course, he came with the first canto written. He wrote that. I think he had written manuscripts for the second canto also. But by the time he got into third, fourth, fifth cantos, he was dictating everything. You can still listen to his dictation of Krishna book. So, in a literal sense, what we are reading in Srila Prabhupada's books is an abstraction of hearing him. Actually, reading itself is an abstraction of hearing. I was doing a program with some deaf people in England. There's a sangha of deaf devotees. Any deaf devotees in Brisbane? Anyway, there's this sangha of deaf devotees. And the way, you know how they do it on the television, you've got the person doing the sign. So I was sitting giving a class, and there was a person sitting next to me doing the sign, and I was giving the class, and it's quite strange because they're all looking at the person giving the sign while you're talking. But anyway, at the end I said, are there any questions? And somebody asked a question, and I said, oh, you can read that in Bhagavad Gita. And the man who was doing the program, he leaned over to me, he said, they can't read. I said, what do you mean they can't read? Anyone can read. He said, no, they can't read because they can't hear. And just see how valuable this hearing is. And you think about your own learning of language. How do we learn language? We hear. How do we learn to write and then read? The teacher goes, C-A-T, cat. And you go, C-A-T, cat. And now you write it, C-A-T, cat. And then the cat sat on the mat. And then the teacher says, now don't make the sound, just make the lips. Then after a while, the teacher says, now don't move your lips. And then you scan reading. And we all scan read. But if we couldn't hear, we couldn't do that. So actually, even, and you link that up with the fact that Srila Prabhupada dictated his books, then actually just, not apart from listening to his lectures, reading his books, you're hearing him. You're hearing him. And every morning in our Guru Puja, we sing, Prema Bhakti Jaha Hoite Advidya Vinasajate. From him, ecstatic prema emanates, and by him, ignorance is destroyed. These books of Srila Prabhupada's, they're little capsules of Krishna prema. Every lecture of Srila Prabhupada is a dose of Krishna prema. Srila Prabhupada was on that platform. He was a lover he is a lover of the Lord. And his instruction basically is you just fall in love with Krishna. Just fall in love with Krishna. And the best way to fall in love with Krishna is actually just hearing from Srila Prabhupada. Because everything he says about Krishna is drenched in love. It's not It's not academic. It's not even scholarly. It's simply purely the expression of a lover of the Lord. How long have I been going? Another 20 minutes. Crank it up. So, this is the real darshan of Srila Prabhupada. This is the real darshan of Srila Prabhupada.
It's not 45 each.
Don't worry about the heckling, it's okay. Sorry? Sorry?
Some of them are reduced in length.
Ah, okay.
Don't worry about the
Where was I? Srila Prabhupada.
You were quoting Prabhupada's spiritual.
We went on from that. Just we were talking about this yesterday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
As you get older, things just out of your mind.
And then we talked-
Talking about what? Darshan. Oh, yes. This is the real darshan of Srila Prabhupada. This is the real darshan. Yeah. The servant of the king and the cat, they both may see the king. But what is each one seeing? It's like Prabhupada gives the example of what does a pickpocket see when he sees a saintly man? Pockets. The pickpocket sees the pockets. That's all he's looking for. So, the real thing is to hear, the real darshan, and therefore the real connection with, not just from your side, but from Srila Prabhupada's side. Allow Srila Prabhupada to connect with you by connecting with him, by hearing him. I mean, I don't have a lot of, actually Gunanava has a lot of stories he can tell you of dealings with Srila Prabhupada. I had very little dealing on a personal level with Srila Prabhupada. And it took me actually several years to realize how fortunate I was. That, well, Gunanava, he went to Vrindavan in 1971 to help build the temple there, and he'll tell you a lot of stories about that period. I went to Vrindavan in 1975 for the opening of the Krishna Balaram Mandir. I'd only been living in Melbourne Temple at that time for 3 months. And I just went with the understanding that we'd be maybe 2 months in India and then back to Australia. But Srila Prabhupada wanted every temple, every zone in the world at that time to leave 2 devotees on a 3-month rotation for a year or 2 to help man the temple, because there was a skeleton crew there during the building of the temple. But of course, once the temple opened, there were 3 altars and guest house to manage and so many things that needed a lot of devotees. So I suddenly found myself in Vrindavan, left behind. And I was there in Vrindavan from that time until the beginning of 1977. And Srila Prabhupada used to visit a lot during that time. So with one thing and another, I found myself having some exchanges with Srila Prabhupada. And, well, maybe I'll relate a couple of them. Hari Suri was Prabhupada's personal servant from sometime late in 1975 to I think about midway through 75 till around the end of 76, early 77, about 18 months. So he was traveling with Srila Prabhupada. And one time when Srila Prabhupada and his entourage arrived in Vrindavan, sometime I guess in the early 76, Hari Suri had a very heavy fever and he wasn't able to massage Srila Prabhupada. So he recommended that I do it. So in those days, of course, the Samadhi wasn't built. Where the Samadhi stands now, up to the front of the property, it was still the mud huts that the devotees lived in while the temple was under construction. And then, of course, by this time, late 75, the Gurukul was under construction. And that building that now stands opposite the Samadhi against the wall of the Gurukul was the snack bar. So I was having my mid-morning snack of chips at the snack bar, and all of a sudden, Harikesh is standing there and he's saying, Bhagavat Ashraya, you have to get down and get changed. You have to go and massage Srila Prabhupada. And first of all, I thought he was kidding me. I said, yeah, okay. And he said, no, I'm serious. You have to get down there now. And then I realized he was serious. So in a matter of 10 minutes, I'd gone from there to the Brahmachari ashram, which in those days, again, changes. In those days, who's been to Vrindavan? Yes? And you've had prasadam in the restaurant on the ground floor of the guest house? Yes. Well, in those days, that wasn't there. And the building itself is, it's a circular, or more or less circular building, and it has an open atrium inside, and it was built in such a way that the outside of the circle is the guest house rooms, and then on the inside of the circle we had the brahmachari rooms, which have all been, they're just sealed off now, aren't they? They're not used at all anymore. There's a whole other hostel, whole other realm in there, yeah. So that was the brahmachari ashram. So I was down there and I had my shower and got my gamsha on, and before I knew it, I was in Prabhupada's bedroom. And Srila Prabhupada was sitting, talking to, well, Harikesh was there. Harikesh was Prabhupada's kind of permanent secretary at that time. I think Jagadish was there. Prabhupada used to have one of the GBC men travel with him a month at a time, and he was there. The temple president was there, Akshayananda, and they were talking with Srila Prabhupada about local affairs. And I came in and I sat down, and Prabhupada just glanced at me and then just ignored me and talked to these people. And then after a little while, Hari Suri came in, and he introduced me. He said, this is Bhagavat Ashraya, he's going to do your massage now. The other men left, and it was Hari Suri and I just there with Prabhupada. And that was really the first time Prabhupada actually, he paid any attention to me. He started just looking at me while Hari Suri was talking about how I was going to stand in for the massage. And Hari Suri had just given me like a 2-minute rundown on, this is how you massage Prabhupada. And I'm like, okay. So then we got started. So I sat, Prabhupada used to sit to take his massage. He didn't lie down, like there was no massage table or anything. He used to sit cross-legged on the floor with his hands on the floor in front of him. And you would start by massaging his head with sandalwood oil. So after Hari Sauri had introduced me, Srila Prabhupada said, so let's get started. And I sat down in front of Srila Prabhupada and I started to get the sandalwood oil in my hands. And he says to Hari Sauri, does he know the art? So Hari Sauri says, well, he says he knows what to do, Srila Prabhupada. And you know, in those days also, you know, devotees didn't like shave their own heads. We had a barber used to come, and the barber would shave everyone's head. And you know how the Wallahs, they do the head massage with slap the head like this, and, you know. And I'd had that done to me, and I'd watched them doing it. So I started massaging Prabhupada's head, and I started doing these things like that, and he went, oh. And he looked at Hari Sauri, he said, oh, he knows the art. So then Hari Sauri left. Hari Sauri left, and there I was, just alone with Srila Prabhupada to do this massage. So after you finished massaging his head, then you have to make sure you put the lid on the bottle, and then go and sit behind him, and then you start using mustard oil. Prabhupada used to say that mustard oil has 8 times the protein of beef. 8 times the protein, and you get it into your body by rubbing it in. So Prabhupada used to have a massage 2 massages every day. The second massage was at night while he rested, and you didn't use any oil then. But on that massage in the day, he had the oil. So then with the massage oil, you sit behind him and start rubbing his back, doing his back. And I started doing that, and he started falling asleep. And he said, oh, well, this is good. Sleep is coming. So my head's going bigger and bigger. Thinking, oh, I'm massaging Prabhupada here. And I'm doing it well. He's happy. And anyway, so after the back, then he would put one leg out, and you massage his leg, and the same, then each arm. And a little bit on his chest and belly. So when that's over, Prabhupada would take a little mustard oil in his hand, and he'd rub all the orifices of his body with mustard oil. So while he's doing that, you go into his little bathroom. And the bathroom of his off his bedroom, and it's a triangular room. The double doors are here. There's one long wall there. There's a toilet off that in another little room, and then it comes up, and behind the door is where the taps are with the water. And he'd have 3 very large brass buckets. You'd fill one with hot water, really hot water, and one with totally cold water, and Prabhupada would mix that in his 3rd bucket and just have his bucket shower. So while he's doing his own personal business, I went into the room and turned the taps on. And he came in, and he went along that long wall, about 8 feet from the door, was a little hand basin with a little mirror there for shaving. And he was standing at the mirror, and he was looking to see if he needed a shave. And I'd finished the water, and I was standing in the doorway, 2 doors. You know how in India you have the bowl. So I'm standing there, And he was looking in the mirror, and I said, "Is there anything else, Srila Prabhupada?" And he just said, "No." So I stepped back, closed the doors, and threw the bolt. And I'm standing there, and I just locked Prabhupada in his bathroom. And in that instant, he realized what had happened. And he was at the other side of the door, and he's pulling on the door. And I'm like, it's like every time I'd go to pull the bolt, he'd pull the door, and the bolt would jam. So it's like, and I'm getting more and more panic, and I'm like, ah. And I was on my knees at the door, and finally I threw the bolt, and the doors flew open. And Prabhupada was standing there looking down at me. I'm like, I'm sorry, Srila Prabhupada, I just made a mistake. And he was looking at me. I thought flame was going to come out of his eyes. And you know, when Prabhupada used to get really angry, his lip would quiver. And his top lip was quivering, and he was looking at me. And I just was blubbering, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, Srila Prabhupada. I just didn't think. And in the end, he goes, and off I went. Yeah. But just a funny little thing was that the next day, I had to do it for about 10 days. It was just amazing. I could say the night one as well, a little bit. But anyway, the next day at the same point in the massage, I'm standing at the door and he was at the mirror. And I said, "Is there anything else, Srila Prabhupada?" And he went, first of all, he went really stern. And he said, "Yes." And then he started to giggle like a little boy. And this big smile came on his face. He said, "Yes. Don't lock the door." So, how are we now?
It's time for a bit of Q&A or something.
Any Q&A? Any questions or anything?
I have a question. Remembering you telling us about this before, a time when you asked Srila Prabhupada about his books and how come he'd written so many books.
We need more water up here. Well, one other story. I don't know, this would have been sometime in 1976. I was in charge of a traveling Sankirtan party. And Srila Prabhupada was in Vrindavan, and we were going traveling. So it was late in the afternoon. Now again, things were quite different in those days. First of all, the veranda to Srila Prabhupada's rooms wasn't filled in. It was just a veranda. Secondly, when you stepped into his quarters, that little open area that now has steps up into a big room was just a little room. That back room was not connected. So you went off the veranda into this room, which was the secretary used to sit there, and then into Prabhupada's darshan room. So I was quite familiar with Srila Prabhupada's routine at that time, and I knew he would have taken his afternoon nap and he would be in his darshan room chanting. And so, and the secretary was still resting. There was nobody, there was no guard on the door, there was no secretary in the office, it was just Prabhupada in his room. And I was only 25 years old, so I think back now and I don't think I could do what I did then. I don't think I could do it now. But I just walked into Prabhupada's room. And I stepped into his darshan room, paid my obeisances, and he was sitting on his little asana in the corner and chanting, just chanting japa, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. I paid my obeisances. I got up, I stood up, and I walked over, and I sat down probably no further away from him than between you two. But he was sitting up a little higher on his... And he didn't stop chanting the whole time. He didn't take his eyes off me. He just watched me walk across the room, and he just kept chanting. And when I sat down, he just kept chanting for maybe a minute or two. He just kept chanting. Then he stopped, and he just gestured his head as, what do you want? So I started saying, well, Srila Prabhupada, we're just about to go on traveling Sankirtan. And he immediately, he was really interested. Where are you going? What are you doing? So I told him where we were going. I think we were going to Kanpur. And asked me, what programs do you do? And we talked back and forth about the Sankirtan program for just a couple of minutes. And then there was nothing to say. So I was sitting looking at him, and he was looking at me. And then he said, you just chant your rounds every day and chant your Gayatris, and everything will come. And then he said, just like drops of water on a stone, drip, drip. And he put his finger on the table as he said it, and he drip, drip. And it was as if there was a little pool of water there. It was so graphic, where he just went drip, drip, drip. And then he rubbed it and he said, soon a hole is coming. And he gestured with his finger at these books on the wall behind him, and he said, just like these books, every day, little translating, some days hardly one sentence, and so many books are coming. So little drops of water wear away the stone. We might, we're having to practice devotional service in the material world against the relentless onslaught of the material energy. That is a catchphrase of Srila Prabhupada's. You will come across that phrase again and again and again. The relentless onslaught of the material energy. So the day-to-day business of just maintaining an existence in the material world, as we see for everyone, for the non-devotees, it's a total absorption. And in the middle of that, we're trying to create for ourselves some bandwidth where we're simply absorbed in transcendence, chanting the holy name, chanting our japa, chanting our rounds. It's very interesting, isn't it, that we do so many things in the Krishna consciousness society, but when we take initiation, we only promise two things. You follow 4 regulative principles and you chant 16 rounds of japa a day. We don't have to vow that we will go to the temple every day. We don't have to vow that we will be at Mangalati every day. We don't have to vow anything else. But we have to vow that. Because Srila Prabhupada was very, very aware of the potency of the holy name. And not just the potency of the holy name in any abstract sense, but in a very personal sense, that the holy name, like in Kirtan, it's party time. But japa is your time with Krishna. Your time. And Krishna is there for you. And Prabhupada knew that. Prabhupada understood that. So I found that a very cogent statement. Well, you got me going now. I want to tell one last little story. Right? The night Srila Prabhupada left to go to London on that last visit, there was a very wealthy life member called Lakshman Agarwal, Lakshman Lighting, and he'd lent one of his Mercedes-Benz to the devotees, and they'd put a mattress on the back seat, and they drove Prabhupada up from Vrindavan with him on that mattress in the back seat of that car. And when they got to the airport, the car was parked off in the car park for a while devotees arranged with the airport authorities that Prabhupada could just come around, get into a wheelchair and go straight to the plane. So we were waiting while that happened, and then they drove Prabhupada around. And there was some delay getting the wheelchair. So Prabhupada was sitting up by this time. He's sitting up in the back of the car, chanting japa. And the window was down. The back seat window was down on the passenger side. And I was standing there at the window, just looking at Prabhupada. And in the days before that, I'd had a telegram come from Vrindavan that there was this very famous Vaid who had come to tend Srila Prabhupada, and he'd asked that we get crushed pearls and a musk gland. So I'd had to go around all over Chandi Chowk. Chandi Chowk's amazing. Old Chandi Chowk. You get down there, and Prabhupada said you can get anything in Chandi Chowk. Anything. So I had to trace out a musk gland. And musk glands were not legal at that time because, too many people had killed too many musk deers and they were an endangered species. So I found myself in this room, and I got this musk gland, and I got the crushed pearls, and I had them taken down to Vrindavan. So I was just looking at Prabhupada, and I was saying, oh, we did these things, we got these things. And Prabhupada had his head down, and he was just nodding like that to what I was saying. And then, again, there was nothing else to say. So from within my heart, I didn't verbalize this, but from within my heart, I was praying to Srila Prabhupada, and I was saying, Prabhupada, I'm only a very young devotee, and I'm experiencing a lot of difficulties, but I promise you that I will never leave you. And of course, there was nothing verbal with this, but as soon as I'd expressed that, Prabhupada just put his head up and looked me right in the eye. And he had that look on his face, really strong, steely look, that, well, if you're serious, so am I. And then all of a sudden, he smiled. And it's like Sally Agarwal said about Prabhupada, and when he smiled, it was just oceanic. This huge smile came on his face. And just like, and this is where I saw what Prabhupada used to say about the courage of the British officer and the heart of the Bengali mother. That steely look was like the British officer. If you're serious, so am I. And then this smile came. And with his eyes, he just caressed me. He just looked at me up and down while he smiled in such a loving way. And then he just put his head down again. That was the last exchange I had with Srila Prabhupada. But that has carried me for how many years now? 47 years? Hare Krishna.